Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark channel. I'm so excited to have you here today. I hope you're all feeling fantastic and ready to dive into something super valuable, just like our wild and unpredictable river adventure with 3 travelers and their mischievous dog, Monty. As we journey through swan battles, cat encounters, and unexpected swimming lessons, we'll also focus on enhancing your English listening and speaking skills right at the comfort of your home. It's all about building your confidence, improving your fluency, and making learning fun. Let's get started and light up your English journey from home to wherever your dreams take you. Chapter 1. The Health Conundrum. There were 4 of us: Henry, Jack, Luke, and me, Tom. We were sitting in my living room, passing the time with cigars, feeling sorry for ourselves. It was a quiet afternoon, but the conversation quickly took a rather depressing turn. We started talking about our health, and soon we all realized that we weren't exactly in the best shape. We had a bit of a strange routine when we got together. We'd talk about how we felt physically, of course, but none of us were really doctors. We just assumed that the more we talked about our problems, the closer we'd get to a solution, even if we didn't quite understand what was wrong with us in the first place. Henry spoke up first. He said that he'd been feeling dizzy a lot lately. It wasn't just the occasional lightheadedness. He felt it frequently, enough to be genuinely concerned. I think that's when the rest of us started to feel a bit uncomfortable. If Henry was talking about dizziness, then we were all thinking about our own issues. Jack chimed in next, mentioning that he'd also been experiencing dizziness, but it wasn't just that. He said he felt a sense of nausea that wouldn't go away. His stomach wasn't happy at all, and it had been bothering him for weeks. The strange thing was, none of us really did anything about it. We just kind of lived with it. Then, I couldn't help myself. I had to talk about my own health problem. I'd been dealing with a bad stomach for ages, and I wasn't shy about admitting it. I knew I had a bad liver. I was pretty sure of it. Why? Because I'd read about it. I had read everything I could find about liver problems, and every single symptom listed seemed to match what I had. Every single one. If I went through a list of symptoms, I could tick off every single one. Fatigue, bloating, poor digestion, you name it. I had it. It got worse every time I looked up more information. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I was just a walking illness. Every time I came across a new disease, I'd say to myself, I've got that too. The more I read, the more illnesses I added to my personal list. One day, I went to the library at the British Museum to look up a minor health problem that had been bothering me. But once I got there, I found myself reading about something far worse. I can't even remember the name of the disease now, but I was convinced I had it. It sounded horrible. The book was so convincing, and I read about it for hours. The more I read, the more I started feeling like I was doomed. I realized that I had most of the symptoms of every disease in that book. There was only one disease I didn't have, and that was housemaid's knee. I found that oddly disappointing. I thought, why not that one too? Why don't I have that? I'm pretty sure I have everything else. By the time I had finished reading, I was convinced I had just about every disease known to man. I thought my life was about to end. There was no way I could live with this many illnesses. I was done for. So I decided to do the only thing I could think of. I'd visit my doctor. Now my doctor is an old friend of mine, and whenever I felt sick, I'd go to him, expecting the worst, only for him to tell me that I was perfectly fine. It's a bit of a running joke between us. He'd listen to my complaints, look me over, and then casually dismiss everything. "You're fine," he'd always say. "Nothing wrong with you at all." It was almost like a game at this point. But this time, I was determined to be taken seriously. I knew something was wrong, and this time, I wasn't going to let him tell me it was all in my head. I thought to myself, this doctor's going to get more practice out of me today than he's had in years. I walked into his office and sat down, ready to tell him everything. "Doctor, I need you to listen," I said. "If I tell you everything that's wrong with me, you'll be dead before I finish. It's going to take forever." I could see the confusion on his face. He'd heard my complaints before, but this time I was serious. So I took a deep breath and decided to tell him what was not wrong with me. "I don't have housemaid's knee," I said, "but I have everything else." I went on to explain everything I'd read in that book. The symptoms, the diseases, everything. He listened to me carefully, like he always does, but I could tell he wasn't as concerned as I was. I could see him trying to hold back a smile. I know my doctor well enough to know that he wasn't really worried. He took my pulse, listened to my heart, looked at my tongue. After a few moments, he scribbled something down on a piece of paper, handed it to me, and told me to go see the chemist. "Here," he said, "this will take care of everything." I took the prescription, but I didn't even look at it. I knew. I had to go to the chemist anyway, so I just stuffed it in my pocket and left the office. When I got to the chemist, I handed over the prescription without a second thought. The chemist looked at the paper, looked at me, and then handed it back. "I'm afraid I don't have what's on this prescription," he said. "But you're the doctor's patient, aren't you?" I nodded, a little confused. "Yeah, I guess so." "Well then," he said, "it's not up to me to question the doctor, but you'd better follow his advice." I looked at the prescription. It said, "Every 6 hours, eat a hearty meal, drink a pint of beer every morning, walk 10 miles every day, and go to bed no later than 10 p.m. And for the love of all that's holy, don't read books about things you don't understand." It wasn't exactly the sort of prescription I had in mind, but I decided to follow it. And believe it or not, it worked. I started to feel better almost immediately. I felt better not just physically, but mentally as well. My health issues were still there, of course, but they seemed less pressing. I didn't feel like I was dying anymore. In fact, I felt pretty good, except for my liver problem, of course. The liver problem was another story. The main symptom of liver disease, I learned, is constant fatigue and a lack of interest in working. And let me tell you, that's been a part of my life since I was a kid. Back then, doctors didn't know much about liver disease. Instead of diagnosing me, they just called me lazy. Lazy little devil, they'd say. Go out and work. They had no idea what was wrong with me. Instead of giving me liver pills, they gave me blows on the head. I didn't mind, though. After each blow, I'd go off to work, and it worked. Better than any modern pill I'd ever tried. But I digress. The point is, my liver's still bad, and I'll always have that lingering feeling of fatigue. But with the doctor's prescription and a little less stress, I've been managing. That day, as I sat in my room with Henry, Jack, and Luke, discussing our various ailments, I realized one thing. Maybe we were all just a bit too focused on our health problems. Life goes on, even if we don't feel 100%. It's all about getting through it with a little humor and a lot of patience. We continued talking about our health, but I wasn't as worried as I had been before. Maybe I wasn't dying after all. Maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. Chapter 2. The Boat Trip Idea. After our lengthy discussion about our health, we all agreed on one thing. We needed a break. Our bodies were exhausted, our minds were even more so, and it felt like every little discomfort was just a symptom of the larger problem, burnout. The conversation shifted from ailments and illnesses to something we could do to escape from them for a while. The idea of a vacation came up, but what kind of vacation would actually help us recharge? We were all staring at each other, unsure of where to start. Henry was the first to speak up. He leaned back in his chair, took a long puff of his cigar, and said, "You know, I think what we really need is a complete change of scenery, something peaceful, something quiet." Jack, who was always the most practical of the group, frowned at the idea. Quiet? Peaceful? That sounds terribly boring. What would we even do there? Just sit around and watch the grass grow? No thanks. I need something with more action. I need something exciting to look forward to. We all looked at Jack, knowing full well that he wasn't the type to enjoy silence or relaxation. He thrived on activity, on things that kept him on his toes. He was the kind of guy who could never sit still for too long without getting agitated. "What kind of exciting vacation are you talking about, Jack?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Jack leaned forward, his eyes glinting with excitement. Well, if we really need a change of pace, why not head to the sea? Imagine it, the wind in your hair, the smell of salt in the air, the endless horizon. I think a nice boat trip along the coast would be just the thing. The sea is a great place to relax, but it also has plenty of adventure to offer. We could get on a boat and see where the current takes us. There was a moment of silence after his suggestion. We all exchanged glances, and I could tell everyone was mentally picturing what a sea trip might look like. The idea of the ocean was appealing in its own way, but something didn't sit right with me. I could already feel the familiar sense of dread creeping in. Hold on a second, I said, trying to suppress a frown. The sea sounds great in theory, but have you ever actually been on a boat for more than a day? It's not all sunshine and cocktails. It's seasickness, endless rocking, and let's not even talk about the boredom of just being stuck on the water. Imagine being stuck on a boat for days with nothing to do but feel miserable. I'd rather avoid that entirely. Henry, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. Tom's right. The sea can be romantic in the movies, but in reality, it's much less glamorous. The rocking of the boat can make you sick after just a few hours. The last thing we need is a vacation that turns into a nightmare. I could see Jack's enthusiasm start to wane. All right, no boat trip on the sea, but we still need something to change the pace, a break from the grind, from the constant noise of city life. What if we head to the countryside? I blinked at Jack. The countryside? Well, that's a bit of a shift, isn't it? You know, I'm not sure if I'm cut out for endless fields and silence. There's only so much fresh air and quiet that one man can handle before it starts driving him mad. Jack rolled his eyes. You're always so dramatic, Tom. The countryside is perfect for relaxing. We could find a cozy little spot by a river, set up camp, and just enjoy the peace and calm. It would be a place to truly disconnect. I considered it for a moment. The idea of fresh air, open fields, and a peaceful environment wasn't entirely unappealing. But then again, there was something about it that seemed a little too slow, a little too much like stepping into another era. I don't know, Jack. It sounds nice, but do we really want to spend our whole vacation just sitting around? There's no excitement there. No thrill, I replied. Luke, who had been unusually quiet until now, finally spoke up. All right, how about this? We compromise. What if we combine both ideas? Get the peace and quiet of the countryside, but on the water. We could take a boat, trip up the river. That way we get the calm of the countryside, but we also get to move around, explore, and get some fresh air without the monotony of just sitting still. The suggestion was met with mixed reactions. Luke had a point. There was something nice about the idea of traveling down a river, taking in the scenery, and being surrounded by nature, all while still having the freedom to move around and enjoy some adventure. Jack leaned in, suddenly looking more interested. Now that sounds like something I could get behind. We'd be on the water, but we'd have control over the pace, and we wouldn't be stuck in the middle of the ocean with nothing to do. Henry nodded in agreement. I like that. Plus, it gives us the chance to stop wherever we want, explore little towns along the way, and actually enjoy the journey, not just the destination. I had to admit, I was starting to warm up to the idea. A riverboat trip didn't sound nearly as exhausting or nauseating as an open sea voyage. There would be adventure, but it wouldn't be as extreme. It felt like the perfect balance between relaxation and exploration. All right, I'm sold, I said, leaning back in my chair. A riverboat trip it is. Let's do it. We'll find a nice quiet stretch of water, bring along plenty of food and see what happens. Who knows? It could be the perfect escape. Everyone nodded in agreement. There was a certain excitement in the air now, a feeling of anticipation. We had made our decision, and I could already feel the tension starting to lift. We were going on a riverboat trip, a journey that promised the relaxation we needed, with just enough adventure to make it exciting. But of course, just as we were about to finalize our plans, there was one small detail that I hadn't yet considered. Monty, my little terrier. I looked over at him as he lay curled up on the floor, snoring peacefully. What would he think of all this? He was never one to enjoy quiet trips. He was a dog who thrived on excitement, and I wasn't sure how he'd handle being stuck on a boat for days on end. Still, that was a problem for another time. For now, we had a plan. A riverboat trip. The perfect solution to our health conundrum and the perfect opportunity for an adventure. Chapter 3. Packing. The day had come to start preparing for our riverboat trip. Everyone seemed excited at first, but as we started to talk about the logistics, the excitement quickly turned to a mix of confusion and frustration. It was time to pack, and none of us were really sure where to start. As usual, I took charge of organizing things. Someone had to do it, and it might as well be me. All right, gentlemen, I said. Let's get this packing done. We'll need a list of essentials, and I'm the one who's going to make sure we don't leave anything behind. If we forget anything, it's on me. Henry, who was never one for planning, immediately slouched back into the armchair, looking like he was preparing for a nap. You're doing the list? You sure? I thought we could just toss a few things in a bag and go. Jack, on the other hand, was far too enthusiastic. I've got a great idea. We'll need some sturdy boots, waterproof jackets, extra socks, and plenty of food. Oh, and don't forget the first aid kit. You never know when we'll get injured. Out there, right? I stared at him, wondering if he was serious. Jack, we're not heading into the Amazon jungle. We're going on a river. We're not going to need half the stuff you're suggesting. But Jack was already on a roll. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and started scribbling down a long list of supplies, completely ignoring my suggestion that we might need something a little more practical. "I think we should start with the basics," I said, trying to regain control of the situation. "We need clothes, of course. Nothing too fancy, just practical stuff. We'll need some good walking shoes, something light but sturdy, and of course, a few warm layers for when it gets chilly in the evening. Also, remember the sunscreen and bug spray. We don't want to come back with our skin looking like a map of the world." Henry finally sat up and added, "What about the tent? Are we going to sleep under the stars or in a proper tent?" "No, I'm not a fan of sleeping on the ground." "Well, I'm not a fan of sleeping on the ground either. But we're not going to drag around a giant tent for no reason," I replied. "Let's just bring a small, lightweight shelter. We'll make do with that." At this point, Jack interrupted, his eyes wide with concern. "Small tent? You mean we're going to sleep in a shoebox? We need something big enough for all of us to stretch out in." "Jack, we're not building a mansion on the riverbank," I said, trying to calm him down. "Let's just get something simple. We'll be fine. If we end up needing more space, we'll find a way to make it work." But as I was saying this, I realized that, in fact, none of us had a clear idea of what simple meant when it came to camping gear. Our small tent could turn out to be a circus tent, or we could end up with something that was little more than a glorified sheet. We needed to find a balance between practicality and comfort. Meanwhile, Luke had been sitting quietly, writing down his own list. He was the organized one, and I knew I could count on him to actually think through the essentials. He looked up at me with a knowing smile. "All right. So we've got the basics: clothes, food, shelter, and first aid. What about cooking gear? We'll need pots, pans, a stove, and a kettle for tea. I assume we're not relying on firewood for everything?" I nodded. "Good thinking. We'll bring a small camping stove, but let's make sure it's easy to use and doesn't require too much attention. We can't afford to spend hours trying to get the fire going every night. Plus, let's bring some easy-to-prepare meals, stuff we can just heat up and eat without much fuss." Then came the issue of food. Jack, unsurprisingly, had strong opinions on what we should bring. "We need something hearty. Canned beans, sausages, bacon, eggs. Oh, and don't forget the snacks. I'm not going on a trip without my chocolate." Henry immediately added, "I second the chocolate. It's a must. And how about some fresh fruit? We can't live on canned food alone." I felt a bit overwhelmed by the sheer volume of suggestions. "Okay, let's keep it simple. We need non-perishable items, like pasta, rice, biscuits, and fruit. The chocolate can stay, of course, but let's keep the rest light and practical." Luke, who had been quietly scribbling his notes, then raised a very good point. "What about drinks? We can't just drink water the entire time, can we? What if we want something more than just a cup of tea?" I sighed, relieved that someone had thought of this. Right, we need something to wash down the food. We can bring tea and coffee, of course, but I also think we should have some beer. Just a couple of cans for the evenings. Maybe a bottle of wine, too, if we're feeling fancy. As the packing conversation continued, the group's enthusiasm started to wane a bit. It was starting to dawn on all of us that packing for a trip wasn't as simple as it seemed. We all wanted to bring a little bit of everything, and it quickly became clear that we didn't have enough space for all the things we wanted to take. All right, we're going to need some kind of organization for this, I said, standing up to survey the piles of gear scattered across the room. Let's get our clothes packed first, and then move on to the food. We can use the big suitcase for the clothes and keep the food in separate hampers. That way everything will be in its place. Jack immediately protested. But I want to put my boots in with the food. What if we run out of supplies and need them for survival? Jack, I said with a grin, you're not going to need your boots to eat beans, trust me. Luke, ever the problem solver, picked up the suitcase and started organizing our clothes. I'll get the boots packed. You two deal with the food. Let's get this over with. And so we set to work. The room was a mess, with clothes piled high on one side and food scattered everywhere on the other. At one point, Jack knocked over a stack of cans, and we had to scramble to pick them all up. Meanwhile, Henry was lying back in his chair again, occasionally offering advice but mostly taking the opportunity to nap. As we continued packing, I started to wonder just how much space we had in the boat. We had to keep it all light, manageable, and most importantly, practical. A boat wasn't exactly the place for luxury items, and I didn't want to be the one carrying around a heavy load for the entire trip. After what felt like hours of packing and repacking, we finally managed to get everything sorted. We had our clothes, our food, our cooking gear, and all the other necessities. We had a plan, and it was now time to head off on the next part of the journey, actually getting all of this onto the boat. As I looked around the room, I couldn't help but smile at the mess we had made. It was chaotic, yes, but it was also kind of perfect. We had what we needed, and now we just had to hope we hadn't forgotten anything important. After all, there was still plenty of time to deal with whatever else went wrong along the way. Chapter 4. Starting the Journey. The day had finally arrived. The day we were all supposed to head out for our grand riverboat trip. To be honest, I wasn't sure we were ready. We had packed, repacked, and argued about what to bring. We had gone through lists and discussed every possible scenario. But now that the moment was here, there was a strange sense of anxiety hanging in the air. I woke up early, not because I was particularly eager to start the day, but because I had a feeling that if I didn't get ahead of everyone else, the whole trip would descend into chaos. I quickly dressed, grabbed a quick breakfast, and made sure all of my gear was packed and ready. The others, of course, were nowhere near as prepared. Henry was still snoozing in his bed. Jack was lounging in his chair, and Luke was meticulously checking the list once again to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything. The boat was waiting for us at the dock, nestled against the riverbank, and it looked like a boat. Nothing particularly special about it. It wasn't the biggest vessel, but it seemed sturdy enough. I suppose that's all that mattered, right? Still, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Would it be able to handle the weight of all our luggage? Would it even stay afloat if we packed it too heavily? These thoughts lingered in my mind as I approached the boat, checking it from every angle. Luke was already at the dock, directing the crew. Well, not really a crew, just the two of us who had to do all the work. Jack had yet to make an appearance. Typical. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him approaching, arms full of bags, looking harried and a little bit out of breath. "I hope you've packed light," I called to him. "We're not taking the Queen Mary down the river." Jack grinned. "Light? I've packed my essentials. You know, a few spare jackets, some extra shoes, and of course, chocolate." He patted the bag proudly. "You can never have too much." "Chocolate?" "Yeah, and we'll be eating chocolate for every meal if we don't watch it," I muttered under my breath. Henry appeared a few minutes later, stretching and yawning, clearly not in any rush. "What's all this fuss about? I thought we were supposed to be relaxing, not running around like headless chickens." "We are relaxing," I said, trying to keep my irritation in check. "But first, we need to get on this boat and actually go. You know, the part where we leave the dock." Henry shrugged and finally trudged over to the boat. He tossed his bag onto the deck carelessly, but it landed with a loud thud. I winced as I wondered what was inside. Hopefully nothing fragile. By this point, I was growing anxious. The sooner we got started, the better. I climbed onto the boat, taking a moment to survey the scene. The river stretched out in front of us, shimmering under the morning sun. It was beautiful, no doubt, but the sight didn't do much to calm my nerves. I glanced over to Luke, who was already checking the boat's ropes, making sure everything was secure. "All good?" I asked. Luke nodded. "All set. We should be good to go. But let's not forget, we've got a lot of weight on this boat. It's not exactly designed for luxury travel." "I'm not expecting luxury," I muttered. "But I would appreciate it if we didn't sink halfway through the trip." "Don't worry, Tom," he said with a smile. "I'm sure we'll be just fine. This boat has made it through worse, I'm sure." With that, we pushed off from the dock and began our journey down the river. It was a slow start. We had to get used to the rhythm of the boat, rocking back and forth gently as we made our way out onto the water. The sound of the oars splashing in the water was oddly soothing, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease as the boat moved further into the open river. I looked around, taking in the scenery. The banks of the river were lined with trees and tall grass, and I could see the occasional bird soaring overhead. It was peaceful, in a way, and I was starting to appreciate Luke's suggestion. Maybe this trip wasn't going to be so bad after all. But of course, just as I was starting to relax, Jack leaned over the side of the boat and shouted, "Hey, does anyone else feel like we're moving awfully slow? This is supposed to be an adventure, right? Not a drifting picnic?" I rolled my eyes. Of course, Jack couldn't enjoy the tranquility of it all. No, he needed excitement, speed, something to keep him occupied. "We're not in a race, Jack," I called back. "We're here to enjoy the journey, not speed through it." Jack shrugged. "I'm just saying, a little more speed wouldn't hurt." At this point, Henry leaned against the side of the boat, lazily watching the water. "I'm fine with the speed. I just want to make sure we have a good meal once we settle down. I'm starving." "Yeah, we're all starving," I muttered, already thinking about the food we had packed. We'd brought plenty of supplies: biscuits, cold meats, and of course some canned goods. But we had to be careful not to eat everything too quickly. We had a long journey ahead of us. After a while, the boat seemed to find its pace. We got used to the steady rhythm of rowing and the gentle rocking of the boat. It wasn't as fast as Jack would have liked, but it was peaceful. As the day went on, we stopped for a quick break near the riverbank. We'd planned to stretch our legs, take in some fresh air, and maybe grab a bite to eat. Monty, who had been sitting quietly by my feet, suddenly perked up at the sound of some distant rustling in the bushes. I could tell something was coming. Monty, my little terrier, was always on alert, and sure enough, a small group of rabbits darted out from the underbrush. Monty, in typical fashion, bolted towards them, yapping furiously. The boat rocked violently as he jumped up and ran, and we all scrambled to keep our balance. "Monty!" I shouted. "Stay on the boat." But Monty wasn't listening. The rabbits were too much of a temptation. For a moment, we thought he might fall into the river, but somehow he managed to stop at the edge just in time. He barked and growled, frustrated by his inability to catch the rabbits, and eventually came back to sit at my feet, panting heavily. "Great," I sighed. "Now we've got a dog that thinks he's a rabbit hunter." Jack laughed. "Well, at least it's not boring. This trip is going to be interesting for sure." After Monty settled down, we spent the rest of the afternoon rowing, talking, and enjoying the sights around us. The day passed more quickly than any of us expected, and before we knew it, it was time to think about setting up camp for the night. We pulled the boat to the bank and set up our tent. It wasn't the easiest task in the world, but we managed, and soon we were sitting around a small campfire enjoying our dinner. The peace of the river, the warmth of the fire, and the sound of crickets in the background made for a perfect evening. As we sat there, eating and laughing about our earlier mishaps. I couldn't help but feel grateful. It had been a long day, but we had made it. We were on our way, and despite the minor chaos that seemed to follow us around, I could tell that this was going to be a trip to remember. The next morning, we'd continue down the river. But for now, we had our first night under the stars, and that was enough. Chapter 5. The First Day. The sun had barely risen when we set out from our camp. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the water. It was the perfect way to start our journey. A calm, peaceful morning, the quiet broken only by the gentle splash of our oars as we pushed away from the riverbank. For a brief moment, the chaos of the previous day seemed to fade into the distance, and I found myself truly enjoying the serenity of it all. But of course, serenity was only temporary with our group. Even in the stillness, there was something about being on that boat that seemed to bring out the worst, and sometimes the best, in all of us. Henry, who had been less than enthusiastic about the whole idea from the beginning, was already sitting comfortably at the bow of the boat, looking like he was on vacation. His legs were stretched out, his hands behind his head, eyes half-lidded as though he had nothing better to do than take in the scenery. He was more content than I had ever seen him, but I had a feeling it wouldn't last long. Jack, on the other hand, was already growing restless. The boat moved slower than he would have liked, and I could see his fingers twitching as if he was about to start pacing back and forth across the small deck. He leaned over the side of the boat, inspecting the water like it was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. "How much longer until we reach our first stop?" he asked, barely concealing the impatience in his voice. "I can't sit still forever, you know." "Relax, Jack," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "We've got a long journey ahead of us. There's no rush." Jack let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly not thrilled by the idea of a slow-paced trip. "I was thinking we could try rowing a little faster. Get to the next spot faster, get some food, and maybe stretch our legs. I'm not a fan of just drifting." "We'll get there when we get there," I replied, trying to ease his anxiety. "We're here to enjoy the trip, not to break any records." Meanwhile, Luke was busy making sure everything was running smoothly. He was checking the ropes, making sure our supplies were secure, and carefully navigating the map. I admired his attention to detail. He had a quiet efficiency that balanced out Jack's restlessness and Henry's laid-back attitude. "We're not in any danger of running aground or losing anything, are we?" I asked, glancing at Luke. "Nope. Everything is secure," he said with a smile, looking up from the map. "We're on track, and the water's smooth. Just keep your eyes on the horizon." As the boat glided forward, we continued on our way, the water rippling gently beneath us. The trees and grass along the river banks seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, creating a sense of isolation, which was exactly what we needed. The city, with its noise and distractions, felt like a distant memory. But of course, that tranquility didn't last long. Just as we started to get comfortable with the pace, we heard Monty bark from the back of the boat. "Monty!" I called, looking back to see my little terrier standing at the stern, furiously wagging his tail as though he had spotted something. "What is it now?" The little dog's eyes were fixed on something in the distance. It wasn't long before we spotted it too, a small flock of ducks paddling leisurely on the water. Monty, always the predator, was determined to chase them down. Without hesitation, he jumped up and ran toward the edge of the boat. "Don't even think about it, Monty," I shouted. But it was too late. Before I could react, Monty leaped over the side, sending a ripple through the water. He landed with a splash, and for a moment, there was a horrible silence. We all stood frozen, watching in disbelief as Monty tried to swim toward the ducks, barking at the top of his lungs. "Great," I muttered. "Now we've got a dog in the water." Luckily, Monty wasn't a poor swimmer. He paddled in the water with surprising ease, though it was clear he was getting further and further away from the boat. Luke grabbed an oar, trying to steer the boat toward Monty, but we were already too far out. I had to jump in after him. Cursed under my breath as I dove into the water, feeling the cool current rush around me. It wasn't exactly a pleasant experience, and I soon realized just how cold the water was. The shock of it made me gasp, but I pushed forward. Monty was now barking at the ducks in frustration as they swam out of reach. I reached him just as he seemed to realize he wasn't going to catch them. "Come on, Monty," I said, panting. "Let's get you back on the boat." Monty swam toward me, his little legs paddling furiously, and I grabbed him by the collar. He gave me a confused look, as if he couldn't understand why the ducks weren't falling into his lap. I hauled him back to the boat, his fur dripping wet, and we finally managed to get him back on board. "Well, that's one way to start the day," Jack said, chuckling at the spectacle. "Monty's already got more excitement than the rest of us." "Yeah, well, he'll sleep like a log tonight," I said, dripping water everywhere as I clambered back onto the boat. I handed Monty off to Henry, who looked at the dog as though he might be a little too much trouble. "You know, I thought we were going on a peaceful trip." "Didn't think we'd be swimming with the dog this early," Henry muttered. But he was smiling, despite himself. We all took a moment to catch our breath and get back into the rhythm of the trip. The calm waters of the river were soothing, and, after Monty's little adventure, the rest of the day seemed to fall into place. By mid-afternoon, we reached a small town along the river, and we decided to stop for a break. We pulled the boat up onto the riverbank and tied it securely, then got out to stretch our legs and explore. The town was quaint, with cobblestone streets and old buildings that had a timeless quality to them. It felt like a place where life moved slower, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle we were used to. We found a small cafe by the river and decided to sit down for a bite to eat. Our provisions were good: biscuits, cold meats, and some fruit. But it was nice to take a break from the boat and enjoy some hot food. We all sat around the table, joking and laughing about Monty's little swim, sharing stories of past trips, and discussing the rest of the journey. "So, how's the first day been?" Luke asked, raising his glass in a small toast. "Not bad, right?" I grinned. "Not bad at all. I'd say it's been a perfect start." Jack nodded. "I could do with a bit more speed, but it's nice, I'll admit. Peaceful, even." Henry, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up. "This is the kind of break I needed. No phones, no work, just this." We finished our meal and got back on the boat, the rest of the day passing quickly as we continued along the river. The sky had started to turn orange as the sun began to set, and we decided to stop for the night. We found a quiet spot to camp by the water and set up our tent. As we sat around the campfire that evening, the sounds of the river and the crackling fire seemed to wrap around us in a comforting embrace. We had survived the first day, Monty's adventure, Jack's impatience, the peaceful boat ride, and it felt like we were truly on our way. And despite the minor setbacks, I had to admit, this trip, this adventure, was starting to feel like just what we all needed. Chapter 6. The Laughing Tin. The morning after our first night on the boat, I woke up early. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was already streaked with the first hints of orange. I glanced around the camp, and everything felt still, quiet, peaceful, the perfect setting for what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. But, of course, nothing ever goes exactly as planned when you're with this group of friends. We had made a pact the night before to get an early start. We all agreed that after breakfast, we'd get back on the water, row for a few hours, and take our next break at a small village we'd seen marked on the map. But as I stood up from the tent, stretching my sore limbs, I could already hear Jack grumbling about breakfast. "Hey, who's cooking?" he called from the boat, sitting near the stern and glaring at the row of cans we had left from the previous night. "I'm starving." "Not it," I called back reflexively, even though I was probably the only one who knew how to cook. I wasn't exactly eager to make a meal after the previous day's chaotic start, but I knew someone had to do it. Luke was sitting cross-legged, fiddling with the stove. "I'll do it," he said calmly, as always, with the kind of confidence that made you feel like everything was under control, even if you weren't so sure yourself. "I think I'll try something simple. How about scrambled eggs?" Jack looked horrified at the suggestion. Scrambled eggs? You're not going to ruin them like last time, are you? I looked over at Luke, who was setting up the stove with his usual careful precision. Maybe scrambled eggs aren't such a great idea, I muttered, thinking back to the disaster with Harris trying to make them the other day. How about something simple like sandwiches? No sandwiches. I want something hearty, Jack insisted. We need to keep up our strength. We're on a river trip, not a picnic. All right, Luke said, shaking his head as he started cracking the eggs. Hearty scrambled eggs it is. Don't say I didn't warn you. As Luke got to work, I glanced at the cans of food we had packed. Some of them were easy enough. Beans, vegetables, some fruits. But there was one tin that stood out among the rest. The laughing tin. I wasn't sure what was in it, but the label had a picture of a big smiling face on it. The phrase, "laughter in every bite," was written across the front in bold letters. It was one of those things we had thrown into the pile without thinking, mostly for a laugh. It was too ridiculous to leave behind. I picked it up, turned it over, and saw that it was sealed tightly, with a date that had passed by at least a year ago. Well, it certainly looks cheerful, I muttered, half laughing at the label, even though I wasn't sure what was inside. Don't open that one, Jack said from behind me, eyeing the tin. I swear, every time someone opens one of those ridiculous novelty tins, something goes wrong. First, it's all fun and games, and then we end up with a mess. You're not wrong, I agreed, staring at the tin as I imagined it could spill something sticky, or worse, explode in our faces. Maybe we save this one for later? But Jack wasn't having it. No way. We're opening it now. What? If it's something delicious? Something we didn't know we needed? Despite my hesitation, we all agreed it would be a good laugh to open it. So I grabbed the can opener, and with a little bit of effort, I pried open the tin. And then, something strange happened. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual hiss as the seal popped open, and a slight smell of something vaguely sweet. Maybe it was pineapple? But then, as the lid lifted fully, we all heard it. A soft, almost musical laugh. It was low and quick, like someone had pressed a button to play a sound effect, and it was followed by another, even louder laugh. And then, another. We froze, staring at the tin in my hands. I told you, Jack yelled, his face contorting in both surprise and disbelief. What did I tell you? It's cursed. It's a haunted tin. But we were too mesmerized by the sound. The tin kept laughing, each time more exaggerated, more ridiculous. The sound echoed in the quiet morning, making it feel like the whole forest was chuckling at us. I swear, if I hear that laugh again, I'm throwing it in the river, I muttered, holding the can away from me as if it were some kind of cursed artifact. I'm getting out of here, Luke said, looking at the laughing tin like it had a mind of its own. This trip just took a turn for the weird. But then, something even stranger happened. The tin didn't just laugh. It started to rock, as if it were shaking itself, rattling within the can. We all stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or scream. It was as though it had a life of its own. The laughter started to build, echoing louder and louder, and that's when the tin exploded. Okay, maybe not exploded, more like popped with a sound that was somewhere between a pop and a bang, and out of it shot a small stream of confetti, followed by the sound of a horn honking. For a moment, none of us knew what to do. The boat shook as if caught in a sudden gust of wind, and we all jumped back, startled. Well, that's it. I'm done. I can't do this anymore, Jack said, looking a little too serious for someone who had just witnessed a tin full of confetti and honking horns. This whole trip has gone to the dogs. The laughter from the tin had stopped, but the confetti was everywhere. It floated around us in the morning sun like a bizarre, colorful shower. Monty, who had been sitting quietly up until then, looked completely confused by the sudden mess. He barked at the bits of paper floating around him, trying to bite at them as they drifted past his face. I couldn't help myself. I burst into laughter. I swear that tin was just waiting for the right moment to mess with us. Luke, trying to keep his composure, shook his head, but even he couldn't hide the smile spreading across his face. Well, that's one way to start the day, he said, looking around at the paper strewn across the boat. We spent the next few minutes cleaning up the mess, but it wasn't just the confetti. The experience had thrown us all off guard, and the rest of breakfast was filled with laughter, more jokes, and all the usual banter that came with traveling with these guys. It felt like the kind of thing we'd talk about for years to come. A tiny tin of laughing confetti that set the tone for our journey. Despite the chaos it caused, I had to admit, today was going to be one of those days we'd look back on with fondness. It had started with an absurd little tin and ended with all of us laughing in the most ridiculous way possible. I was starting to think this trip was exactly what we all needed, even if we hadn't exactly planned for the confetti explosion. We finally managed to get breakfast cooked, although we were still cleaning confetti out of the boat for the next hour. Monty kept trying to catch the last floating bits, and by the time we were ready to leave, he had managed to swallow a few pieces of paper. The thought of it made me laugh even harder, even as I tried to keep the boat steady for the next leg of our journey. As we pushed off again, I glanced back at the now empty tin, still lying on the deck. Somehow, I wasn't even surprised when I noticed it was still faintly vibrating. I wasn't sure what we had unleashed with that can, but I was certain we wouldn't be opening any more laughing tins anytime soon. And with that, we carried on. The river seemed even more alive, even more full of surprises. And as for us, we were ready for whatever else this bizarre trip had in store. Chapter 7. Monty and the Cat. The day started off with promise. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the river and the surrounding trees. We had all agreed that after a hearty breakfast and some good laughs, we'd set off early and make good progress on the river. There was a quiet optimism in the air. It seemed like everything was coming together nicely, despite the occasional hiccup, like Monty's brief swim in the river yesterday. We had settled back into our routines, each of us taking turns with the oars or sitting back and enjoying the view. Henry was still lounging at the front of the boat, a look of contentment plastered across his face. Luke was busy checking the maps and ensuring our course was on track. Jack, as usual, was fidgeting, but this time he seemed more subdued. Maybe he was coming around to the idea of relaxing a little. Monty, however, was on high alert. He'd been quiet all morning, which should have been a sign that something was about to go terribly wrong. I knew that Monty, with his keen senses and curious nature, was bound to get into some sort of mischief sooner or later. And this time, I wasn't wrong. We had been drifting along the river for a few hours when we came to a small, picturesque village. The place looked like something out of a storybook, quaint, with narrow cobbled streets lined by ancient houses. A gentle breeze blew across the water, and we decided to stop and stretch our legs for a bit. Monty, of course, had other plans. "All right, let's stretch our legs," I said, pulling the boat up to the bank. "But keep an eye on Monty. We don't need another swim incident." Jack snorted, shaking his head. "As if we need more surprises. We should have just left him back at the dock with the cat." The cat. That's when it all started. We hadn't seen the cat at first, but there it was, sitting on the front steps of one of the houses, its green eyes fixed directly on Monty. It was a large, sleek black cat, with an almost regal air to it. There was something about the way it sat, unmoving, that caught Monty's attention. Monty, for all his energy and mischief, was no stranger to confrontation, especially when it came to other animals. "Monty, leave it alone," I muttered under my breath as I watched the dog's posture shift. His tail went stiff, and he started to growl low in his throat. He wasn't one for picking fights with other dogs or animals, but there was something about this cat that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way it sat there, staring, completely unfazed by his presence. Henry noticed Monty's fixation and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like someone's in trouble again." "Not again," I muttered. "He's fine. He's just staring at it." But Monty wasn't just staring anymore. Before I could stop him, he bolted. It was as if the cat had given him some invisible signal to make the first move. He darted off the boat, landing on the riverbank with a soft thud, and started charging toward the cat with all the determination of a professional hunter. "Monty!" I yelled, but it was too late. The cat, in a move that could only be described as perfectly timed, leapt off the steps and landed gracefully onto the ground, just out of reach. Monty's momentum carried him forward, but the cat had already sidestepped him, effortlessly gliding to the side. And with that, Monty went face first, into the dirt. For a moment, there was silence. Then, like a trap springing shut, the cat let out a short, sharp hiss, its back arched in an impressive display of feline superiority. Monty, not one to back down, immediately regained his footing, growling and barking in frustration. He charged again, but this time the cat didn't move. Instead, it stood its ground, staring Monty down with an intensity that left me feeling slightly uncomfortable. The two animals stood locked in this absurd, silent standoff, each one waiting for the other to make the first move. Monty, despite his best efforts, couldn't get closer. Every time he lunged, the cat would calmly step back, maintaining its position, almost mocking him. Jack burst out laughing, clearly entertained by the spectacle. "Looks like Monty's met his match," he said between chuckles. Monty barked once, loudly, and then, out of nowhere, the cat took action. It lunged, swiping at Monty's face with lightning speed, its claws just grazing his nose. Monty yelped, startled, and jumped back in surprise. He stood there, his tail between his legs, and looked at the cat like it was an alien creature. I had never seen Monty so taken aback. For all his bravado, he hadn't expected the cat to fight back like that. I walked over, shaking my head. "All right, Monty, that's enough. You're not winning this one." But Monty wasn't done. He backed up a few paces as if giving himself room to strategize. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He sat down. The cat, still perched in its regal stance, stared at him for a long moment. And just when I thought Monty might finally accept defeat, the cat did something completely unexpected. It started to walk away. Monty, still sitting on his haunches, watched the cat, his eyes wide. As the cat turned its back on him, he stood up, tail wagging slightly, and made an exaggerated show of walking after it. The cat stopped for a moment, glanced over its shoulder, and with one final condescending flick of its tail, trotted off into the bushes. Monty, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. He stood there, as if processing the fact that the cat had won. His tail drooped, and he let out a quiet whimper. He had clearly met his match, and there was no way around it. "Looks like the cat's the boss here," Luke said, his voice full of amusement as he watched the dog. Henry, laughing, shook his head. "I've never seen Monty so humbled. That cat's got some serious attitude." I couldn't help but smile at the ridiculousness of it all. Monty, my little troublemaker, had finally met an opponent who didn't back down. He'd learned the hard way that some animals simply aren't afraid of him. I patted him on the head as he sulked back to the boat, trying to shake off the humiliation. "Better luck next time, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "At least it wasn't a rat." Jack, still chuckling, remarked, "I think Monty's going to be avoiding cats for the rest of the trip." We all climbed back into the boat and set off again, the strange encounter with the cat already becoming a part of the day's stories. As the boat drifted further down the river, Monty settled down beside me, resting his head on my lap. He was no longer the proud, energetic dog he had been before the encounter. Instead, he was quietly resigned to the fact that maybe, just maybe, there were creatures in the world who could outwit him. And as we moved forward, the day stretched ahead of us, filled with more adventures, more surprises, and more of Monty's antics. But I had a feeling he'd think twice before challenging another cat anytime soon. Chapter 8. Monty Meets a Cat. The morning was unusually quiet for us. We had been rowing down the river for a few hours, the calm sound of the water against the boat acting as a soothing backdrop to the conversations we had along the way. Jack was in one of his thoughtful moods, occasionally glancing up from his map to suggest where we should stop for the day. Henry was sprawled lazily at the bow, his hat pulled low over his eyes as he napped in the morning sun. Luke, as always, was keeping an eye on the riverbanks, making sure we didn't run aground or veer off course. Monty, on the other hand, had been unusually quiet. He had spent the morning lying at my feet, his small body barely moving except for the occasional twitch of his tail. I had noticed this odd behavior for the last few hours. Monty, the ever-vigilant dog, wasn't the type to sit still for long. But today, it seemed like something was different. We had passed by a couple of picturesque little villages along the river, each more charming than the last. It wasn't until we came upon the next village, a little further down the river, that Monty's behavior shifted. I noticed him sit up and start sniffing the air, his ears perked up in that familiar alert way. He didn't bark, didn't whine, he just sat there, fixated on something ahead. I couldn't see what it was, but Monty's reaction was enough to get my attention. "Do you think he smells something?" I asked Luke, who was sitting at the stern, looking through a pair of binoculars. Luke lowered the binoculars and followed my gaze to Monty. "Maybe. He's been a bit off today. He's usually running around looking for something to chase." Before I could respond, Monty suddenly leaped up and bolted towards the side of the boat, growling under his breath. I caught the flash of his little legs as he sprinted to the edge, his body tense, his eyes locked on something. It was then that I saw it. A small black cat sitting on a low wall, casually observing the boat as it drifted toward the riverbank. Monty. "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. With a burst of energy, Monty lunged off the boat, landing on the muddy bank with a splash that echoed through the still morning air. The cat, who had been sitting perfectly still, seemed to register the sudden motion just as Monty took off. It didn't move. It didn't even blink. It just stared back at Monty with a level of indifference that only a cat could possess. I watched as Monty skidded to a halt just a few feet from the cat, barking furiously, his tail straight up in a perfect line of rigid excitement. The cat simply turned its head to the side, not in the slightest bit intimidated, as if it was more bored than anything else. "Monty, get back here," I called, but Monty was in full chase mode now. He barked again, taking a few more steps forward, his eyes locked onto the cat as though he were about to pounce. The cat, unimpressed by Monty's ferocity, yawned slowly, a wide, languid stretch. That made me wonder if it had spent its entire life waiting for the exact moment to ruin Monty's day. Then, it did something that none of us expected. The cat didn't run away or even hiss. It simply sat there for a moment longer, then, without any visible effort, swiped its paw out at Monty. The swipe was so fast and so precise that I hardly saw it coming. In one fluid movement, the cat's claws caught Monty's snout, just a glancing blow, but enough to make him yelp in surprise. Monty, who had been so confident just moments before, staggered back, stunned by the sudden attack. His little paws slid on the dirt as he quickly righted himself and stood, his tail still high, though now twitching uneasily. The cat, meanwhile, simply stared at him with a level of calm that could only be described as passive-aggressive. "Ha! Who's the boss now?" Jack yelled from the boat, clearly enjoying the show. But Monty wasn't finished yet. He recovered quickly, shaking his head, and launched himself at the cat once more, barking with renewed vigor. The cat, still sitting comfortably, didn't move an inch. Monty got close this time, but before he could reach the cat swiped at him again, this time knocking him back a few steps with the speed of its strike. This time, Monty's reaction was different. Instead of charging in again, he took a few steps back, his stance shifting from aggressive to defensive. His head hung a little lower, his tail lowered from its proud stance to a more uncertain position. For the first time, Monty seemed to be considering his next move. "Looks like he's finally realizing who's in charge," Luke muttered under his breath, though there was a clear hint of admiration in his voice. "Monty, come here," I called, again, but he wasn't listening. He stood there, eyeing the cat warily, no longer sure of what to do. The cat, for its part, seemed entirely uninterested in the dog now, casually licking its paw, thoroughly unbothered by the little dog's presence. Monty slowly backed away, glancing over his shoulder at me. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Slowly, he walked back to the boat, his movements cautious, as if he was trying not to provoke the cat any further. When he reached the edge of the boat, he looked up at me, his big brown eyes wide with something that looked almost like confusion, mixed with a touch of embarrassment. He hopped back onto the boat with a soft whimper, clearly not wanting to engage any further. "Good boy," I said, softly, patting him on the head as he curled up at my feet, his tail still between his legs. He had clearly learned something valuable that morning. Cats apparently were not to be trifled with. Jack, still chuckling, looked over at the cat, which was now sitting on the wall, licking its paws as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Well, Monty's got some lessons to learn. He thought he was the king of the world, but looks like the cat's the real ruler here. Henry, who had been watching the whole spectacle from the front of the boat, finally sat up and said, "I think we all underestimated that cat. I thought Monty was the toughest little dog in the world, but I've never seen him back down like that before." Luke, who had been quiet throughout the encounter, simply smiled and said, "Sometimes it's good to remember that not everything can be conquered by force. Monty learned that the hard way." As we set off again, I glanced down at Monty, who was now lying quietly at my feet, his eyes closed. He was still alert as always, but I could tell he was mentally processing the events of the morning. He had met his match in that cat, and it seemed like he was taking some time to digest the experience. The boat continued down the river, the sound of the water gently splashing against the sides a reminder of how much more of this journey we had ahead of us. But now, as I glanced down at Monty, I realized something important. He wasn't just a dog. He was a dog who had learned, for the first time, that there were things in this world that couldn't be defeated with sheer willpower. Some battles were won by simply being patient, calm, and prepared. Monty would carry that lesson with him for the rest of the journey, and maybe, just maybe, he'd think twice before chasing after another cat. Chapter 9. Fighting Swans. The morning after Monty's cat encounter was peaceful. Too peaceful, in fact. The sun had risen in the usual way, casting a golden glow across the river, and the air was still cool with the remnants of the night's chill. We had a good night's sleep by the river, though I could tell none of us were entirely sure what to expect next. After all, this trip was proving to be more eventful than any of us had anticipated. We were slowly drifting along the river, with the occasional splash of the oars breaking the otherwise tranquil silence. Monty, still a little sensitive from his earlier run-in with the cat, was unusually quiet, nestled near my feet. I watched him closely, wondering if he would finally get back to his usual mischievous self, or if he would remain subdued for the rest of the trip. We passed through a lovely stretch of river, the banks lined with weeping willows and tall grasses swaying gently in the breeze. Birds flew overhead in graceful arcs, their calls echoing across the water. The scenery was exactly what we needed, peaceful, calm, and beautiful in its simplicity. But, as always, something was bound to happen. We had been rowing for a few hours when we suddenly heard a series of loud, deep honks from behind us. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of ducks or geese, but then I saw them, a pair of swans, gliding effortlessly across the river. The pair seemed serene at first, but as they drew closer, I noticed something peculiar. They were heading straight toward us. They're coming right for us, Jack called from the front of the boat, looking both excited and a little wary. He leaned forward, squinting. Are they angry? They're swans, Jack, I said with a chuckle. They're not exactly friendly, but they're probably just curious. Henry, ever the skeptic, didn't look so sure. I don't like the way they're looking at us. It's like they've got some kind of plan. We watched in silence as the two swans swam closer, their long necks curving gracefully in the water. Their bright white feathers gleamed in the sunlight, but their beady black eyes never left us. There was something unnerving about the way they were staring at the boat, and even Monty, who usually greeted any animal with boundless energy, was sitting very still now. Well, if they want a fight, they're going to get one, Jack said, reaching down to grab a loose oar. Let's see if they're as tough as they look. I shook my head, laughing. Jack, stop. They're just swans. Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be. But of course, Jack didn't listen. He raised the oar slightly, as if preparing to defend the boat from an incoming assault. I'm not afraid of a couple of swans. We'll show them who's boss. The closer the swans got, the more tense the atmosphere became. We could hear the flapping of their wings, the soft swishing of their bodies through the water. They were now about 10 feet away from us, moving with purpose. And then, without warning, they flapped their wings and let out a series of loud, guttural honks. That's it, Jack yelled, standing up. They're attacking. Henry, now fully awake and on high alert, grabbed onto the side of the boat. Oh no, this doesn't look good. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the boat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. It felt like the swans were surrounding us, circling us on the water. They were so close now that we could see the angry gleam in their eyes. Their sharp beaks pointed in our direction. I had no idea what had caused them to act like this, but there was no doubt that they weren't going to let us pass peacefully. Jack, sit down, I called, trying to get him to stop antagonizing them. But it was too late. With a sudden screech, the larger of the two swans lunged forward, its wings flapping furiously. Jack, who had been standing at the bow of the boat, was taken completely by surprise. The swan's wings brushed against his chest as it came closer, knocking him backward. He stumbled, falling into the boat with an exaggerated yell. The other swan, not to be outdone, followed suit. It swam toward the boat with incredible speed, its wings flapping so powerfully that they splashed water all over us. In a moment of panic, Monty, who had been watching intently from my feet, suddenly leaped into action. He barked furiously at the swans, his small body shaking with excitement. Monty had faced down much larger dogs in the past, but this was different. These swans were not afraid, and they didn't back down easily. With another swift movement, one of the swans leaned over the boat, attempting to get closer to Monty. The little dog, not one to be intimidated by anything, charged straight at the bird. He leapt out of the boat with surprising agility, his paws hitting the water with a splash as he tried to get a bite of the swan's feathers. The swan honked loudly in response, flapping its wings even harder as it tried to push Monty back into the water. This only made Monty more determined. He barked, dodging the swan's attacks and jumping nimbly out of the way. I could see him trying to land a bite on the bird's long neck, but the swan was too quick. It was like Monty had met his match, and it was a fight he wasn't going to win. "Monty, get back here!" I shouted, desperately trying to grab him before he got too close. But Monty, in the heat of the moment, wasn't listening. As Monty and the swan continued to circle each other, the boat rocked dangerously. I quickly grabbed hold of the side of the boat to steady it, but Jack, who had recovered from his earlier fall, was now standing with an oar in his hand, looking as though he was about to take a swing at the swans. "Stop!" I shouted. "We're not fighting them, Jack. Just let them be." But Jack, looking utterly undeterred by my plea, swung the oar at the larger swan. To his surprise, the swan wasn't intimidated. It actually flew at the end of the oar, flapping its wings with force, pushing Jack backward into the boat once again. The smaller swan seemed to take offense to this and honked loudly, swimming closer to the boat. This time, I could feel the tension in the air. This was no longer a minor disturbance. The swans were on a mission to defend their territory, and they weren't backing down. At this point, Monty, realizing that he was losing the battle, finally gave up. He yelped and swam back to the boat, pulling himself up as best as he could. I grabbed him quickly, pulling him away from the swans. "All right, that's enough," I barked. "We're done here." The swans, satisfied that they had made their point, flapped their wings one last time, honking loudly. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they swam away. The tension in the boat slowly faded as we watched them disappear into the distance. Jack, soaked and a little disgruntled, looked over at me. "Well, that was unexpected." "You think?" I said, shaking my head. You're lucky they didn't sink the boat, Jack. Henry chuckled from the front. That's one way to ruin the peace of a river trip. We sat in silence for a moment, trying to recover from the chaotic encounter. Monty, now safe and sound, was lying at my feet, looking up at me as if asking why he'd been so foolish to challenge two angry swans. I stroked his head, reassuring him that it wasn't his fault. Well, that's one for the books, Luke finally said, breaking the silence. I've never seen anything like that before. Maybe next time we should leave the swans alone, I said, grinning despite myself, and with that, we resumed our journey. The river seemed quieter now, calmer somehow, as if the swans' brief reign of terror had left a mark on all of us. But at least for the moment, it was behind us. And as we continued down the river, I knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, we were ready for it. After all, how much stranger could this trip possibly get? Chapter 10. 3 men out of a boat. The sun was beginning to set as we reached the next stretch of the river, casting long shadows over the water. The mood in the boat was light, even after the chaos of the past few days. The Swan incident was still fresh in our minds, but the laughter that followed had lifted everyone's spirits. We had been rowing for hours, the rhythmic splash of our oars filling the otherwise silent air, and there was a quiet camaraderie among us now. Despite the mishaps, the boat had become a kind of sanctuary, a place where we could escape from the grind of everyday life. All right, how about we make this stop our last for the day? I suggested, breaking the peaceful silence. We've been at it all afternoon, and I don't know about you, but I could use a break. Jack, who had been fidgeting with the oars, finally looked up from his quiet contemplation. Sounds like a good idea. I need a drink. The fresh air's great, but my throat's as dry as the Sahara. Henry raised an eyebrow from his position at the bow, his head tilted back to look at the sky. A drink, you say? Well, I'm not one. To turn down a good beer after a long day of rowing. Luke, who had been diligently keeping an eye on the map, marked the spot where we had planned to stop for the night. There's a small village up ahead. We can tie up the boat, walk into town, grab something to eat, and rest for the night. We're all due for some downtime. I glanced over at the others, who all seemed to be on board with the plan. Let's do it then. We deserve it after everything we've been through. We made our way to the shore, where a small dock jutted out into the river. The village ahead looked quaint, nestled between a cluster of trees. A warm orange glow radiated from the buildings, making it seem like the perfect place to rest after the long day. As we began pulling the boat up to the dock, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The chaos of the past few days had taken its toll, but now it seemed like we could finally take a moment to breathe. We would settle in for the night, enjoy a cold drink, and wake up refreshed to continue our journey. But as we neared the dock, something strange happened. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Jack suddenly yelled, causing me to jerk my head toward him. His voice was filled with alarm. I quickly turned around just in time to see Jack lose his footing and tumble off the boat, landing with a loud splash into the river. The sight of him flailing in the water sent a momentary chill down my spine. "Jack!" I shouted, trying to steady the boat with my oar, but it was no use. He was already in the water, sputtering and flailing around like a fish out of water. He didn't seem to be in any real danger, but the sight was enough to send us all into a panic. "Get him out of there!" Henry yelled, jumping up to grab an oar. "We can't just leave him there." Luke, always the calm one, was already reaching over to the side of the boat. "Jack, hold on! We've got you!" he shouted. "Don't worry about me," Jack yelled back, half laughing and half gasping for air. "I'm fine. Just a little mishap." I looked over the side, where Jack was now floating on his back, his arms spread out as though he were trying to imitate a swan. "This is not how I imagined a peaceful evening, you know," I said dryly. Jack, still laughing, didn't seem too concerned about the situation. "Well, I wasn't planning on going for a swim, but I guess I'm getting the full experience, right?" Henry sighed, clearly not amused. "You've got to stop doing that. What if you hit your head on something?" It's fine, Jack said, waving us off. "I've had worse." Luke reached out his hand. "All right, get in the boat. Before you start doing laps in the river." Jack grinned. "I'm not getting in just yet. I think I'll take a little swim, clear my head. But thanks for the offer." Henry shook his head in exasperation. "You're lucky we don't just leave. You out there? You're not getting any sympathy from me." Despite Henry's grumbling, I could tell we were all just relieved that Jack wasn't actually in trouble. The fact that he was laughing and joking around made it clear that he was fine. After a few more moments of waiting in the water, Jack finally swam back to the boat, using the side to pull himself up. He was soaked to the bone, but there was no sign of actual harm. "Now, that was refreshing," Jack said, dripping wet and smiling as if he had just completed the most invigorating workout. He climbed back into the boat, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "All right, I think I'm ready for a drink now." "You're lucky you didn't get swept downstream," I said, my voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "Next time I'll make sure to stay in the boat," Jack said, still grinning. "But let's be real. This is an adventure, right? What's a trip without a little excitement?" Luke shook his head, clearly amused, but also thankful that Jack hadn't ended up causing a bigger mess. "Well, maybe next time we'll just leave the swimming to Monty, eh?" Monty, who had been sitting quietly by my feet, looked up at us in confusion as if to say, "What's all the fuss about?" He wagged his tail and then settled back down, his eyes closing as though he had nothing to do with the commotion. "Well," Henry said, still chuckling, "that's one way to get the blood flowing. But let's get the boat tied up so we can grab a drink. I think we've all earned it after today's little swim." We finally managed to secure the boat to the dock, and as we disembarked, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Jack was drenched from head to toe, but his spirits were high, and we all knew that this moment would go down in our travel memories as one of the most ridiculous parts of the trip. The village we had stopped at was just as charming as it appeared from the water. The small streets were narrow, but the local tavern stood at the end of a cobblestone path, its lights spilling out into the street. We made our way to the entrance, where the scent of warm food and a crackling fire greeted us. "Well, I don't think I've ever been this wet in my life," Jack said, shaking off his clothes as best as he could. "We'll dry you off with a drink," Henry said, nudging him toward the door. The evening passed by in a blur of food, laughter, and stories. Jack's little swim became the highlight of the night, and the more he exaggerated the details of his fall into the river, the more hilarious it became. We all shared a hearty meal, enjoying the quiet atmosphere of the tavern as the warmth of the fire melted away the chill from Jack's impromptu dip. As the night wore on and we began to feel the effects of a long day, we decided to turn in early. Our journey had taken unexpected turns, sometimes frustrating, sometimes humorous, but it was exactly what we needed. The next day, we would continue down the river. But for tonight, we could rest easy knowing that the strangest moment of the trip was behind us. Or at least, we hoped it was. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.